They called him a traitor. Others called him a hero. But who was Robert E. Lee, really? In the final days before America tore itself apart, one man stood at the center of the storm, raised in honor, forged by war, torn between loyalty to his country and his homeland. He would lead the most infamous army in American history, yet refuse to fight again after defeat. This is not just the story of a Confederate general. It's the story of honor, duty, and the tragic weight of legacy. A story still echoing in classrooms, monuments, and political battles today. Before you take a side, hear the full story. He was born in 1807 in Stratford Hall, Virginia, into one of the South's most distinguished families. Robert Edward Lee inherited more than just a famous name. He inherited the burden of legacy. His father, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, was a Revolutionary War hero, but also a man whose later years were marred by debt and disgrace. The shadow of his father's failures followed Robert through his formative years. Despite these early setbacks, young Lee grew up disciplined, quiet, and profoundly dutiful. He entered West Point in 1825 and graduated second in his class without a single demerit. A feat of rare discipline. He was destined for greatness, but few could foresee the path that greatness would take. Lee's early military career was marked by engineering excellence. He built forts, improved rivers, and displayed an intellect that gained the respect of his superiors. During the Mexican-American War, he finally saw battle. There, he distinguished himself under General Winfield Scott, whose praise for Lee bordered on reverence. Scott would later say, "Lee is the best soldier I ever saw in the field." But Lee was not a man who sought glory. His loyalty, restraint, and calculated demeanor made him an enigma. He was a Southern gentleman of principle, and it was this very principle that would later lead him into the heart of America's bloodiest conflict. As the storm clouds of Civil War gathered, Lee found himself caught between two loyalties, to the Union he had sworn to defend and to his native Virginia. That choice would change the course of American history and his own legacy forever. Robert Edward Lee was born on January 19, 1807, in Stratford Hall, Virginia, into a family with deep Revolutionary roots. His father, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, was a celebrated cavalry officer during the American Revolution and a trusted ally of George Washington. But by the time Robert was a young boy, the Lee family name had fallen from grace. His father's financial ruin and imprisonment for debt left young Robert with little more than a tarnished legacy and the burden of restoring family honor. At just 18, Robert was appointed to the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he graduated second in his class, without a single demerit. Discipline, duty, and quiet resolve defined him. Fellow cadets described him as reserved but respected, a man who led more by example than by command. His early military career saw him posted to engineering assignments, forts, harbors, and defense installations. Yet it wasn't until the Mexican-American War that his brilliance truly emerged. Under General Winfield Scott, Lee distinguished himself in a series of daring maneuvers. Scott himself would later call him the best soldier he ever saw in the field. But Lee's true dilemma was not found on a battlefield. It was within his soul. As the Union fractured and Southern states began to secede, Lee found himself caught between two loyalties, one to the flag he had served for decades and one to Virginia, his native soil. He loathed secession. He believed slavery was a moral evil, but he could not bring himself to raise his sword against his home, So when offered command of the Union Army in 1861, he declined. Instead, with deep sorrow, he resigned his commission. It was a decision that would change the course of American history and seal his fate. When Robert E. Lee joined the Confederacy, he did not do so with the fire of rebellion. He joined with the solemnity of a man burdened by duty. Initially appointed to command Virginia's military forces, Lee's rise within the Confederate ranks was slow. Early setbacks in Western Virginia cast doubt on his leadership. He was relegated to desk work, overseeing coastal defenses, while more aggressive generals led Confederate forces into glory or ruin. But in June 1862, everything changed. General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, and President Jefferson Davis appointed Lee to lead the Army of Northern Virginia. It was a decision born of necessity. Within weeks, Lee redefined the Southern war effort. He was not reckless. He was strategic, methodical, but willing to take enormous risks when cornered. In the 7 days battles, he drove back Union General George McClellan's forces from the gates of Richmond. It was Lee's first major victory, and it electrified the South. Then came Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, each battle etched deeper into Lee's mythos. He maneuvered like a chess master. His enemies often outnumbered him, but his use of terrain, surprise attacks, and psychological warfare allowed him to strike first and dictate the terms of battle. But this era of glory was not without shadows. At Antietam, his Maryland invasion ended in retreat. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. Though technically a draw, it gave President Lincoln the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lee knew the tide was turning. Supplies were thin, the Union was industrially superior, and the Confederacy was slowly being strangled. Yet he pressed on, hoping a major victory on Union soil would break the North's will. So in the summer of 1863, he led his army north into Pennsylvania. The clash would take place in a small town few had heard of, Gettysburg. Gettysburg. The name alone echoes through history like a thunderclap. In July 1863, Robert E. Lee led his army into Pennsylvania, confident and determined. He believed that a decisive victory on Union soil could shatter Northern morale and perhaps force peace negotiations. But what unfolded was a brutal, chaotic, and costly encounter that would mark the beginning of the Confederacy's slow collapse. The battle began with promise. On July 1st, Lee's forces pushed Union troops through the town of Gettysburg, capturing the high ground south of town. But despite his success, Lee made a fateful error. He continued to attack instead of fortifying his position. Over the next 2 days, he launched wave after wave of assaults against well-entrenched Union lines atop Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top. Lee's confidence in his army's invincibility clouded his judgment. He believed his men could do the impossible. On July 3rd, he ordered what would become known as Pickett's Charge, a full frontal assault across open fields against the center of the Union line. It was a massacre. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were cut down in minutes. General James Longstreet, one of Lee's most trusted commanders, had pleaded with him not to go through with the plan. But Lee insisted. When the remnants of the charge limped back to Confederate lines, Lee rode out to meet them, his face solemn, his voice heavy. He took full responsibility, saying, "It is all my fault." Gettysburg was a turning point. Lee's aura of invincibility cracked. His army, though not destroyed, would never fully recover. The South, once buoyed by dreams of independence, now faced a long and grinding war of attrition it could not afford. Lee offered his resignation, but Jefferson Davis refused. The Confederacy still needed its greatest general. And despite the heavy loss, Lee remained loyal to Virginia, to his soldiers, and to the cause he could not abandon. But as the Union's noose tightened, Lee's path became more desperate, and his choices more constrained. The legend of Robert E. Lee was not built on glory alone. It was shaped in the agony of defeat. By the spring of 1865, Robert E. Lee was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia had been reduced to a starving, exhausted remnant. Union General Ulysses S. Grant was relentless, pursuing Lee with cold precision, cutting off supply lines and blocking every escape. Lee, now worn and hollow-eyed, still hoped to link with General Johnston's forces in North Carolina. He moved west, seeking an opening, but at every turn Grant was there, closing in, pressing harder. Battles at Sailor's Creek and High Bridge shattered what remained of Confederate cohesion. By April 9th, Lee's army was trapped near Appomattox Court House. Surrounded and short of supplies, he faced the unthinkable. For a man who had once symbolized Southern hope, surrender was more than military. It was personal, moral, almost spiritual. Lee met Grant in the McLean house. The contrast between the two men was striking. Grant, muddy and unkempt. Lee, in full-dress uniform, stoic and composed. But there was no arrogance, no bitterness. Grant offered generous terms. Officers could keep their sidearms and horses. Soldiers would be fed and allowed to return home. Lee accepted. When he emerged, his face was pale, his mouth trembling. Soldiers wept at the sight of him. Some offered to fight on, to escape and wage a guerrilla war. But Lee refused. The cause was lost. More killing would only deepen the wound. His final order to his troops was not one of defiance, but of dignity. He urged them to go home and become good citizens, to rebuild what had been broken. The war, for him, was over. But the reckoning was not. Lee returned to Richmond a defeated man. To some, he was still a hero, to others, a traitor. He was not imprisoned or tried, but stripped of his citizenship and barred from holding public office. In his remaining years, Lee would become a symbol, revered by many in the South, resented by others in the North. He accepted the presidency of Washington College, where he focused on education and reconciliation. But beneath the quiet retirement was a man haunted, not by surrender, but by the cost. The dead, the wounded, the shattered families. A legacy soaked in blood and contradiction. Robert E. Lee's war was over, but the battle over his memory had just begun. Robert E. Lee died on October 12, 1870. His death came not with the violence of war, but quietly, after a stroke. He passed in Lexington, Virginia, surrounded by family, in a town far removed from the roar of cannons and the cries of battlefield glory. But the man's death did not end the conversation. In fact, it began a new war, one not fought with rifles, but with memory. Almost immediately, the image of Lee was shaped, polished, and mythologized. Former Confederates called him the Marble Man, the embodiment of Southern honor, duty, and sacrifice. Statues rose across the South, draped in reverence. Textbooks praised his character. Churches named themselves in his honor. He became the centerpiece of the lost cause, a narrative that romanticized the Confederacy as a noble struggle for states' rights, conveniently erasing slavery from the record. But that myth did not go unchallenged. Historians began pulling back the curtain, separating man from legend. They examined Lee's decisions, his choice to fight for a cause he privately questioned, his role in defending a society built on slavery, and his post-war silence in the face of racial terror and inequality. They found a man torn between conflicting ideals, but one who ultimately chose loyalty to Virginia over justice for the enslaved. Today, Robert E. Lee remains a figure of fierce debate. To some, he represents tragic valor, a symbol of dignity in defeat. To others, he stands for betrayal and the defense of a brutal system. His statues have been toppled, his name removed from schools and public buildings, and yet his shadow lingers in textbooks, in politics, in conversations about race, identity, and power in America. The truth about Lee lies not in monuments or slogans, but in the contradictions he carried. A man of principle who chose the wrong principle. A man admired for restraint, who led the deadliest rebellion in American history. A man whose silence after war spoke louder than any order he ever gave. Robert E. Lee did not die a villain nor a saint. He died as he lived, caught between reverence and regret, honor and error. And in that tension, the real story begins. Because the past is not settled, it is remembered, argued, rewritten, and Lee's legacy, like the war he fought, refuses to fade quietly. It is remembered, argued, rewritten, and Lee's legacy, like the war he fought, refuses to fade quietly.